Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presentation. We are very excited to have you on the line with us today. My name is Brooke, and I am in the marketing department here at Edmentum. I will be with you behind the scenes throughout today's presentation on trends in special education. But before we jump into the presentation, I just want to point out a few things on the attendee interface. You'll be able to interact with us through this, so I just want to point out a couple things. So right now, we're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar attendee control panel that you should be seeing on the right-hand side of your screen. You're going to be able to participate in today's event, so we're just going to walk through a few of these features. If you select the orange arrow, you're going to be able to open and close your control panel. The audio pane is going to provide you with all of your audio information. By default, everybody has joined the webinar with their microphone and speakers. However, a microphone is not needed because you will be muted throughout the presentation. But if you are having difficulties with your speaker, you can also join us by telephone. If you select the telephone radio button, you'll get a toll-free number and an access code. You will not need an audio pin since you are going to be muted, so you don't have to worry about that. And then you also have the ability to send us questions through the question pane. So at this point, I'm going to send out a quick test chat to everybody. You should see that pop up in your chat box now. Chat in, say hello, introduce yourself, tell us what school or district you're in. We really want you to interact with us today, so please go ahead and chat in at this time. And I also just want to make sure you guys can all hear me, which is key. So, but like I mentioned before, I will be here with you throughout the webinar behind the scenes. So please, at any point, send us questions that you have, and we're going to go over those at the end of the presentation during our live Q&A session. And then as a final reminder, a couple of you have already pinged me. Today's webinar will be recorded, and everyone is automatically going to receive a link to view this recording tomorrow afternoon by email. You can share that out with anybody that you would like, but you will see that pop up. And then I also want to introduce everybody to our presenter today. So I'm super excited. We have Edmentum's very own Winnie O'Leary on the line with us. She has spent over 25 years in education, from being a classroom teacher to a school board member to special education teacher and curriculum writer and everything in between. And she's sharing her wealth of knowledge with us now as she serves as curriculum manager of educator engagement here at Edmentum. And today she has a great presentation lined up for us. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass over the screen to Winnie.
All right.
Okay.
There
You
we
should
go.
see it now. You got it? All
You
right.
should.
I'm going to let you kick it off.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to put this into the mode where you guys can see it. There we
Got
go.
it. Perfect.
Perfect. All right. So welcome. Hello. And I'm really happy to have you all here. And as Brooke pointed out, it's be a great opportunity for us to have a conversation. If you use the chat or question poll, she'll be monitoring that. So again, I'm easily distracted by shiny things and she will be glad to interrupt me. I have been with Edmentum for about 14 years, almost 14 years, but I come from the classroom, both special ed and gen ed, as well as an infused model classrooms. So I feel like this is a real close to my heart, these issues and topics. So when we start to talk about trends in special education, we really want to look at what the issues are that students and teachers face when discussing these trends or trends in special education. There's so many things here we could consider, but there are some topics that have been bubbling up for the past year, and it's clearly been in the news. We're going to look at a few of those and explore some of the indicators and things to look for. This is our agenda for today. So let's go ahead and start with early intervention, which is really where we should always start. In every state, very young kids can get intervention help if they have developmental delays or specific health conditions. Early childhood intervention programs are designed to mitigate the factors that place children at risk of poor educational outcomes. Such programs provide support for parents, the children, or the family as a whole. ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds Act, enshrines the preschool development grant into law and focuses on program coordination, quality, and broadening access to early childhood education. The program is housed at the Department of Health and Human Services and jointly administered by the Education Department. And it primarily addresses programs targeting preschoolers or 3 to 5-year-old education. However, we know a lot happens in the first few years. If a child isn't where he needs to be with development or early intervention can make a huge difference. Early childhood intervention programs have been shown to yield benefits in academic achievement, behavior, educational process, progression, and attainment, delinquency and crime, and the labor market success, among other domains. Early intervention is for children from birth to age 3. In addition, children older than 3 may be eligible for special services under IDEA and ESSA. These services pick up where early intervention leaves off. And although states provide early intervention, each state does so differently. States define developmental delay in different ways and provide services for different health conditions. Basically, each state has its own rules for which children are eligible. In a few states, you may get services if your child's at risk for a developmental delay because of factors like low birth weight or drug exposure and other environmental issues. In other states, a doctor or a clinician can recommend early intervention. Under the ESSA, states must submit Title I plans to the U.S. Department of Education, and as part of this planning requirement, the newest law calls on states to describe how they will assist school districts and elementary schools that elect to use Title I funds to support early childhood education programs. Under the statute, state education agencies would have a wide latitude to shape this plan consistent with their local needs. Now, this does not speak to early intervention in the sense of supporting birth to 3, but some states have taken the lead and built the early childhood plan, which includes these kiddos, rather than creating a 3 to 5-year-old plan, which is considered early childhood education in its original context. Okay, so if we address the early childhood trends in education and we capture all of the families that might be in need of a stronger foundation for entry into our education system, unfortunately, we still have not solved all the special education needs a student might face. There are events that are external to the classroom and student biology that have impact on classroom instruction. We must take these into consideration, even if they're not part of the qualifying terms of special ed. There are many events that occur in a child's life that can be traumatic. 1 out of every 4 children attending school have been exposed to a traumatic event that can affect learning and/or behavior. Unfortunately, this list of experiences is long and the kinds of traumatic experiences are numerous. So let's pause here for a moment. Research indicates that 1 out of every 4 children have been exposed to a traumatic event. Think about your classroom. 25% of your students right now are dealing with exposure to a traumatic event. And that's not including districts or classrooms that have, say, a common traumatic event. 1 out of 4 breaks your heart a little, doesn't it? How can those students in your classroom not be needing additional supports? However, clearly not 1 out of every 4 students in your classroom are finding themselves receiving special services. Students that face trauma certainly require special accommodations, or their world and their work is significantly impacted by forces outside their control. However, how they manage these events is unique to them. We don't need to go back too far to witness some of the impact that the natural and not so natural disasters have had on education. When Irma hit St. Croix USVI, the island lost power for months, and the district had significant damage to their school. Of their 13 schools, 8 have still not reopened. Then there's Hurricane Maria. While working with a school in Kissimmee, Florida, I saw students from Puerto Rico come bleary-eyed to a part of the world that they didn't know, to try and graduate from a system that they weren't familiar with in a language they didn't speak. FCATs and now FSA, Florida Standard Assessments in Florida, are required for graduation, as well as some EOCs, all of which are administered only in English. And then Florence, drowning out entire neighborhoods and local schools. My college friend is a teacher, and thankfully she and her school were safe, but their school became a shelter for neighboring towns. The devastating fires in California, both natural and man-made, destroyed schools, homes, and communities, creating a need for virtual academies overnight. Hurricane Michael ravaged my home state of Florida, where schools were closed indefinitely. I mean, tell me, how do we look at these students from these locations and not see them as students with special needs? Okay, maybe not in the traditional sense, but they certainly are in need. Natural disasters are but one issue that can have a devastating effect on students, as well as impose compounding issues to students with diagnosed special needs. As educators, we are often facing the same issues as our students. The compounding effect of hurricanes or floodings or whatever on students with special needs is real, and it sits at the top of their original pathology. There are behaviors we can look for and resources that we can put in place, but as educators, and often participants in the same catastrophic events, we need to be aware of the resources and act as part of the solution, not the only solution. There are a myriad of resources. As educators, we don't need to be the final result. There are talented and better qualified resources available to support us and our students. Symptoms to look for include these bulleted points here, things like reduced language skills or heightened challenges, learning challenges, or with becoming withdrawn or loss of developmental gains. All of these are issues that can suggest need for additional supports. These things are worth keeping in mind, and there are others, but there are others that are more experienced in dealing with pieces of trauma. But you, as an educator, may be the critical piece in the first line of defense. You're in the classroom. You're the first to be aware of signs rather than and pay attention to these signs rather than solving the issue. Here are a couple of great links for resources and tools to help you find the right solutions. Students and teachers are often faced with dire situations far outside their control, and managing these situations and addressing the emotional impact can trivialize day-to-day instruction. How do you face the destruction of your world after a traumatic event or multiple ones and continue to learn fractions? Educators and students struggle with these issues far more serious than we like to think. However, there are tools and resources for supporting students, families, and you. So moving into another special ed adjacent concern is homelessness. A homeless child is any youth who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. This actually can look like a number of things. It doesn't mean just one thing. He or she may be sharing the housing of others, living in cars, motels, campgrounds, homeless shelters, bus stations, or even awaiting foster care placement. It is that regular nighttime residence that defines homelessness. Can you imagine how stressful it could be not knowing where you will be sleeping that night? These students come to the classroom looking for one safe and stable place. Students use the classroom as a tether to the ordinary, and all of this pressure is placed on the classroom before a book is opened. We know that education is one critical tool to escape poverty, but we also know that safety and security of the routine is necessary. No parent or student wants to admit that they're between residences. Because families often try to hide their homelessness, many homeless students never gain access to available benefits and services. Signs that a child might be homeless are often signs of other significant issues like abandonment or neglect. Emotionally, these children may close themselves off or become withdrawn, or to the other extreme, become aggressive and defensive. They may act out with inappropriate behaviors. This early trauma and insecurity may be demonstrated with some of the warning signs listed on this slide. Do we consider homelessness as part of special education? Whereas we don't call homelessness out as a branch of SPED, we certainly, it must be considered as an exacerbation of any underlying pathology. We don't think of this as traditional special ed need, but we should consider the effects and treat it like one. According to the McKinney-Vento Act, our country's primary legislation regarding education of homeless students, that's the McKinney-Vento Act, is that primary piece, primary legislation. A homeless child is any youth who lacks a fixed and regular adequate nighttime residence. So there is law around how we address these students. And so what does this act expect? Well, starting at the basics, students who are homeless are to be provided with the same free education as other students. Each state employs a coordinator to ensure that all districts comply. All districts are required to designate a homeless education liaison who must help students enroll immediately, whether or not they have their previous school records. They must set up transportation, access to health care, and other services. They must inform guardians about these available services and much more. So here's your resource. If you notice the signs, find your person. Homeless students are automatically eligible for Title I services from ESSA and as well as its predecessor, ESEA. School districts must set aside funds for this, and each district's Title I plan must describe services to be provided for homeless youth. District Title I coordinators must collaborate with the district homeless liaison. Districts can use Title I funds for hiring special teachers or tutors for homeless students, facilitating parent involvement, funding after-school programs, or summer programs. Additionally, because of ESSA, these students are no longer being buried in the data of state testing. This particular population of students will be counted, and districts will be accountable for growth. These students are part of the subgroup now that are being identified and monitored for growth on state testing. Most states have written this into their plans, the expectation of growth around this very, very specific population. There are still some questions that you need answers to when it comes to your classroom. For example, what does this mean to my state? What is the process for identification? And who is my liaison? On the slide, you have the guarantees by the McKinney-Vento Act. Your district may have others. Find your person. Consider your student population and ask yourself, do my students need a different approach than what I have been doing for years? They may not be considered students with special needs, but surely they have special needs. It's not just the homelessness that we should call out here, but poverty has significant byproducts, including hunger, unintentional injuries, and economic exclusion. Poverty makes it hard for students to have full meals, which leads to malnutrition, which causes developmental problems and chronic health issues. Food deserts or neighborhoods without access to grocery stores and fresh produce are often the ones that are in most need of these resources. Unintentional injuries and poverty often mean that parents have little access to emergency care or the means to pay for it, which can often mean that what could have been a simple fix goes undiagnosed or untreated and can lead to death. Economic exclusion of poverty means that poverty limits the choices a person can make to achieve better health, and then results in worse health outcomes for people in poverty. This affects children in unique ways, causing issues that can make the fit into these special ed categories. I think this makes it clear that we need to defend our breakfast programs. Which brings us to the focus on the whole child in general ed. We must pay attention to educating the whole child. We keep hearing that teachers shouldn't just teach the standards of the classroom, but should teach the whole child. And I come from a special ed background, and I've always thought that this was a strange statement because it seems like common sense. Of course we teach the whole child, but what does it really mean? In today's rush to place numbers on students and to quantify how much they are learning and to be honest, how effective their teacher is, it's easy to only focus on the skills and standards a district and a standardized test deem important. However, we are dropping the ball on what education's main focus is. Education means to produce citizens who can contribute to society and not academic robots. It's about understanding where a student begins and how to travel their educational tightrope of standards and apply learning to the world around us. Critical thinking, collaboration, integrating technology are important skills for anyone. Integrating that, using prior knowledge, learning, and then using these special talents all play into the understanding of the rich world inside and outside the classroom. Special ed teachers have been doing this for years. By creating unique IEPs or individual education plans for their students, setting goals and monitoring progress towards those goals, special ed teachers have capitalized on the talents of students to accomplish these goals while creating students who can function both inside and outside the classroom. This is not a new philosophy in education. Special education has been tailoring instruction for the needs of the whole child for years. The needs of the whole child are designed to be critically important. Recently, I have heard another aim for the classroom instruction, and that's happiness. Great thinkers have associated happiness with rich, intelligent, intellectual life, rewarding human relationships, love of home and place, etc., etc. And we can incorporate this by making the classroom a genuinely happy place. Now, don't get me wrong. I dread the day I walk into a classroom and find happiness posted as an instructional objective. However, what a great thing to keep in the front of your head. Make your classroom happy, a safe and predictable place to learn. Personalized learning for all students can increase chances for inclusion and more dynamic IEPs for students with special needs. For students with disabilities, schools follow a very specific procedure for developing an IEP, which involves selecting targeted goals and services. But even the IEP is not sufficient to guide daily intervention and progress monitoring. Instead, IEPs create the broad structure from which educators can develop a more detailed and practical day-to-day intervention plan. Progress monitoring supports creating a path to reach the successful achievement of these small and large goals. These are probably not new phrases to you on the screen. We've been talking about differentiation and personalized learning for decades. And all of these approaches speak to the process that special education teachers have been doing for years. And taking this through its evolution, we end up at educating the whole child, addressing the needs of individuals with a plan and a focus on creating individuals who are capable of interacting in life after the classroom, apply their learning, and continue to absorb new information. Technology has a place in this conversation. Incorporating technologies increases a student's motivation to learn, as well as personalized lessons to a student's individual needs. Even the students with the most severe and profound disabilities can use assisted technology to join the classroom of typical students, and their potential can be reached in ways we didn't have before. Technology has made leaps in terms of bringing students of special education into the general education classroom. The bottom line is that most students with and without disabilities can and do benefit from the right technology in the classroom. But back to the topic of whole child. If we as educators understand the changes in instruction that support students with special needs, then we can apply these skills to instruction of our gen ed students. The modifications on how we assess, the understanding of complex nature of learning and demonstrating knowledge allows us to open the door to a variety of teaching applications. Teaching uses inquiry method, teaching using inquiry method or project-based learning or finding unique instructional strategies for every child becomes part of the norms of the classroom. Focusing on the whole child allows for a blurring of the lines between strategies we put in place for inclusion and for our inclusion students and our gen ed students. The classroom becomes a program of targeting every student's starting point. Plus, there's a great deal of change happening in the gen ed classroom. For years, these have been the diagnosable and identified classifications here on the screen. Services would, and could be provided for one of these terms or labels as applied. However, we're seeing the dynamic of the gen ed classroom changing and more identified students being placed in a typical classroom environment. There are unidentified students, that, as we've talked about earlier in this presentation, students who have been identified and students who are waiting to be identified, all within this one gen ed class. Students who are moving into the general education classroom that may have needed additional supports and information on. We may have needed that information on them. However, if we embrace the idea of the whole child, and instruction for every child begins at their beginning, it addresses the student's unique abilities and teaches the child with an understanding and celebration of that child's unique beginnings. It maintains an understanding that there are things happening besides the grasp of fractions. One trend in special education is about moving into that least restrictive environment, or the LREs, and often that is a classroom that has never been considered special ed before. Teachers may or may not have partners with special ed certification because these are few and far between. And instruction for these special kiddos falls to the general ed teacher. And one of the challenges teachers face, in addition to everything else on their plate, is providing material that is appropriate in content and grade level for every child. When we are discussing students with special needs, this can often refer to age-appropriate and skills-appropriate content. But there's another population that must be reviewed with an eye toward their special needs, and because of their talents, they often find themselves hiding in that average population. In education, we're describing students who qualify for gifted programs as well as special ed services as twice exceptional learners. Twice exceptional or 2E children are often gifted kids with above average abilities who have special education needs, like ADHD or a learning disability or Asperger's syndromes, etc. Because their giftedness can make their special needs or their special needs can hide their giftedness, they are often labeled as underperforming or sometimes even lazy. There are a lot of students who have exceptional ability in some academic area and significant learning difficulties in other areas. Twice exceptional students are often lost in a school or in an IEP system. They are having their talents neglected in favor of remediation, or confused diagnosticians so that they do not qualify for their much needed differentiated specialized instruction. Their gifts need to be fostered and their needs need to be addressed. Often it's students with a diagnosis that demonstrates gifts in other areas but are forced to compensate or learn to compensate to perform. If we know these students exist in the shadows of our classroom, how do we identify 2E students? The challenges that they face in understanding the whole child strategies to best support the 2E students in our classroom. Rather than trying to use evidence from their weak learning areas to prove that they're not truly gifted, savvy teachers are now learning how to allow these students to experience the same opportunities available for gifted students when they are learning in their strength areas. Twice exceptional students tend to be a low priority. Often it takes a proactive parent to push for testing for both giftedness and the learning and or attention issue. However, it can be that their teachers are the first to raise this possibility. There are a number of studies that generally suggest that 2 to 5% of school-age children are in fact 2E. Some reports report that number being much higher. Additionally, some research has also shown that dyslexia is more common among gifted people in spatial orientation occupations such as art, math, architecture, and physics. School districts are required to look for children with disabilities and provide special education to those who qualify for it. Giftedness is also screened for, but it's often provided separately from a special education program. As you can imagine, this puts students who are gifted and disabled in a unique position, and they can easily slip through the cracks. On the screen are some signs to look for as an educator of these special students, and note that it's not a comprehensive list. It's just a place to get started. The telltale sign of 2E kids can be misleading, and false perceptions can lead them not being provided with the supports they need. Giftedness can add to social and emotional challenges that often come with learning and attention issues. Students face challenges tied to their disabilities as well as their strengths of their talents and their intelligence that can actually camouflage and interrupt learning. Frequent demonstrations of frustration is especially common among children whose talents and learning issues have gone unseen or are only marginally acknowledged. These students may know that they are capable of much and resent that low expectation that others have for them. They may crave independence and exciting projects and may resist the need for supports for their learning and attention issues. These students may be placed in special education classes where they become bored and possibly act out because they aren't being challenged enough. Like many gifted students, twice exceptional learners may be striving for perfection. Students who are 2E often say that they cannot make their brain, body, or both do what they want it to do. No wonder these kids are frustrated. Now, for an ode to the gen ed teachers. We have talked about the population shift in general education classroom to reflect more inclusion students that may require additional supports or changes in our approach to instruction. We have looked at external crises that have impact on students and their learning, and that are never going to be labeled as special needs, but surely they are. We've had brief mention of the absence of special ed teachers to support these growing numbers. And we've also had briefly mentioned that the legislation of ESSA is highlighting and monitoring populations and holding districts accountable for these special populations. If you are a special education teacher, bless your heart. Now go out there and find a gen ed teacher to support. If you're a gen ed teacher, oh, bless your heart. Now find a mentor in the special ed department. We are no longer two separate approaches. The majority of students with disabilities are now served in the gen ed classroom, and as we embrace inclusive practices in our school, we are short of special ed teachers. There will continue to be conversations regarding students we serve and how they will be best served, and and we must continue to reflect on the question of what is special about special ed. And as we've discussed, more and more events are impacting students in the general ed classroom that will have significant impact on their learning. General education teachers have no choice but to be aware of these external issues, warning signs, supports, and continue to value in order to continue the valuable instruction going on in their classroom. What are we going to do to support you? So, in a very short time, we've looked at a number of trends that impact special education. I'm going to ask that, well, let's do this one first. Let's ask that, if we have more than 95% of children with disabilities are being placed in public schools, and many jurisdictions around the country are encouraging inclusion strategies for students with disabilities while seeking to reduce the disparities in exclusionary disciplinary practices. Well-designed, well-supported, personalized learning classrooms can play an important role in these strategies. So we are seeing that, if we're looking at 95% of these kids being in a gen ed classroom and the movement towards that, then we're going to need to have those skills and those strategies put into place. Special needs students are poised to gain through development of quality programs. The majority of IEPs are constructed from social and physical, not intellectual disabilities. And the success gap is far too wide. And increasingly, innovative classroom practices that are using today's technology have a whole lot to offer. So when we look at these 6 trends in special education, what I'd like for you to do is to think about your classroom, think about your school district, think about your state and what you're coming across and what you're facing. And Brooke, I think you had a poll that you wanted to put up.
Yep. We're going to launch this now. So everyone should be seeing that in front of you. So just as Winnie said, which special education trends do you feel most in your classroom or school? Select all that apply. And then once we get some answers in, we'll share the poll with you guys. So if everyone wants to go ahead, and if you're seeing them all, select them all. If you're only seeing one, select one, but feel free to choose as many of the options that you're seeing in front of you. So we've got votes coming in so far. Winnie, I don't know if you can see it on your side, but we've got about 70% of the votes in, and whole child and evolving gen ed teacher role is, we're seeing the most there, followed up
I
by
can see that.
trauma. Yeah. So for those of you who haven't voted, we'll give you guys a few more seconds to let us know. And then, like I said, we'll share the results so everyone online.
This actually feels very, very close to the research that I was doing. Of, how these numbers are breaking down. Whereas the twice exceptional child tends to be hiding. So the idea of this getting a 20 in the 20% really sort of stands to the fact that that kid is hiding. Even though we're looking at probably 2 to 5% of your classroom has these twice exceptional skills, or could be diagnosed with 2E. They're just not easy to find because, we can refer to that as a splintered ability, or, this kid's just really good at reading or really good at math. But in fact, there may be a diagnosable issue on one side and a gifted issue on the other side. So it does make sense that we would fit that one as one of our lower numbers. Trauma, I just think that as a nation, we're just facing that, unfortunately. Homelessness, again, another one of those tools that, and homelessness, and I'm going to throw that in with poverty as well. It's just one of those things that, unfortunately, we just see. What we're seeing is that the change that's happening is that we're starting to see more and more families and youths on the street with those numbers have risen a fairly significant amount since 16. So in the past 2 years, 3 years, we've seen a growth in the youngsters on the street, which is, again, heartbreaking.
So I'm going to
But
share it
yeah,
out, Winnie, so that everyone can kind of see
sure.
what you're
Oh, I'm
speaking to.
sorry.
So now you guys can all see the results that Winnie's talking to.
The whole child and evolving gen ed teacher roles. I think that is just one of the biggest trends that we're having to address. Again, it goes back to that whole concept of um, there's a couple of blogs I've written about this, but the certification process for special ed, the districts are in such need for certified special ed teachers and, for that matter, certified teachers, that there are some corners that are being cut, and there's some alternative uh, routes that teachers are taking, and it's a real challenge, district-wide, school-wide, student-wide, teacher-wide, so that we are including more and more kids with diagnosed or IEPs into a gen ed classroom and calling it an inclusion model, which I think is wonderful. I actually love the philosophy of an inclusion model, but that's only as long as the teacher's getting the support that they need from their special ed co-teacher or partner, um, educator, whoever is mentoring them, to give them those tools and skills that they need for addressing the whole child. So, or a child with special needs. I think what we're starting to see is this trend in education as a whole, not just in special education, towards addressing the whole child, which is going to hopefully provide resources and supports for that gen ed teacher that can be applied to every student, not just to identified students or students with IEPs. Yeah. All right, Brooke, do we have some questions? Are we ready to move on into questions?
We do. So we've got quite a few. So one of the ones is there any movement towards creating a new category for kids who have experienced trauma instead of lumping them into the ed category?
That's a really great question, and not something I'm seeing a lot of movement towards. Typically, because if you think about the examples that I gave, which were hurricanes, floods, and or tornadoes in Alabama recently, we're talking about catastrophic events that are affecting not just a student, but the entire student population of a district. And so that becomes your general ed, if you think about it. Now, there are other pieces of trauma that we didn't get into, that we didn't discuss, which address um, individual areas of trauma, which sometimes make me too sad to even think about. But you start to think about those students getting supports that they need, that are in counseling, that are in uh, that are unique, but again, outside that IEP role. Again, when we're talking about trauma resources, and it's not necessarily your job as a teacher to apply these resources. It's your job to identify the student and get them the resources that they need, and then work with that counselor or that therapist or whoever it is in the classroom to know what to look for, and to work closely with those teachers or those professionals to get a comfortable and consistent space for that kid in the classroom. I hope that answers
So
it.
on the topic of trauma, we got in another question.
Sure.
So could a child who experiences trauma qualify for services under 504?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that's going to depend on your district. The short answer to that is that I can make it fit. If I was writing it up, I would make that fit into a 504 services. The long answer to that is it depends on your district. Are they going to accept this as being a part of that 504 piece?
Great. And then we had a question. I work in a district that believes heavily in full inclusion, but often need to find creative ways to integrate these students. What tech trends can assist in this integration?
Oh, that's a great one too. We got such a smart group of teachers in here. It's there's a lot of assistive technology to help with the students that are severe and profound. So things like voice support. Those are assistive technologies, which are a little bit different than when I say technologies in the classroom. Um, Assistive technologies are something that are unique to that individual to help them interact with the other students and the teachers in the classroom. And I think that those are critical pieces. Whether it's a microphone that this teacher wears, whether it's an aid for that student to have medical support or whatever it's going to be. But there are also technologies that are out there that are available to students um, that may provide the same experience, but on a different grade level. So you may have a student in your classroom you're all working on fractions on a 5th grade level, but Johnny's working on fractions on a 1st grade level, and that technology will be able to help start that student where they are. I think that that's where we start letting the technology do the heavy lifting, using teachers for the art of teaching and technology for the science of it, allowing that technology to help identify and support instruction where it begins for that unique child.
Perfect. Thanks, Winnie.
Sure.
And then we get one about personalized learning. It's a hot topic, but what does it really mean?
And I think that you can ask 100 people and get 100 different answers. And I would move that down the road from differentiated instruction to personalized learning I'm going to see if I can take us back to that slide. To individualized learning to personalized learning to that whole child. And I think what we are looking at is looking at where that instructional level of that student begins, what their strengths are, what their best learning modality is. Do they like to do presentations or do they like to do worksheets? Finding that unique style in which that student's going to A, express themselves, and B, be assessed. So that to me is where we're starting to see that blending or that movement from differentiation to individualized to personalized to whole child. And that's really, I think, where the trending issues are hitting is that whole child. And if we think about writing an IEP for a student with special needs, and we said, here are these broad, heavy goals that the student would have expectations of to accomplish within a year, there's a smaller path that we work into that daily practice. So how am I going to move that student off of A and into B, move them on their educational tightrope or path? And I think that that's what we're starting to see outside of that personalized learning, outside of that individual and differentiating. We're starting to see what is that next step for that child and how is it best for them to do it. So think of creating an IEP for every child, or an understanding of where students are and what their interests are and taking them down that road. It's a huge thing to think about. But once we start recognizing our students as individuals in that and where their goals are and how to get them to their goals, then it starts to fall into place that there are unique ways in which we may group our kids. There are topics that we're going to dig deeper in and use oceans to teach reading instead of using puppies. If this kid's interested in oceans, let's do that on their grade level or on their interest level or on their reading level or their concepts of reading, moving that direction.
Yeah, and just so you guys know, in the follow-up email, I'm going to be linking out to several of Winnie's blog posts, and she goes more into depth into some of these as well, including your specific question, Megan, that we just answered. Okay, so then we had another one. Okay, how do you address general education teachers who do not want the support? They have their lessons done, and should we just add modifications or accommodations for what they have?
Oh, that breaks my heart also. Yes. No, I don't know that modifications and of their classroom is going to solve that issue. I think that it's really about educating and partnering, and part of that is Part of that is personality, part of that is education, part of that is mentoring, part of that is supporting, and part of that is just a plain stubborn teacher who doesn't want to change the way they're doing things and have done things the same way for 30 years. And that's a hard place to be. I just recently came across that, actually sitting on the other side of a table with my nieces, who one of my nieces has been diagnosed as 2E with auditory processing issue, dyslexia, and gifted and talented in arts and music. Sitting across the table from me at an IEP meeting were teachers who consistently give worksheets. So it was a very interesting conversation for me to have, trying to let them understand that this was not how this child learned, and that you may have been doing this for 30 years, but you weren't addressing the need of the child in this case. And so I absolutely get what you're saying about how do I work with a teacher that wants you to modify what they're teaching. I think that you're going to have to change their mind. Good luck to you. Bye bye. No, I think that you've really it's one of those things that you can do modifications, you can do adaptions, you can do additional experiments and reteaching information. But until you can convince this teacher that what they're doing is actually not benefiting the student in their classroom, you're pushing rocks up a hill. I wish I had a better rainbows and unicorns and sunshine answer for you. But it's really about showing that teacher that their instruction is missing the need of the child, and they are not having impact. They are not teaching at that point.
Great, thank you, Winnie. Those are all the questions that we've gotten so far. If you are typing in a question, please continue to do so and we'll answer that. I'm just going to do some wrapping up. As a reminder, this has been recorded. Everyone will receive a link to this recording tomorrow afternoon by email. And then just so you guys know, there's several links on the additional resources on some of the slides. We are going to include the slide deck, so you will have access to a bunch of those links that Winnie had included in the presentation. And then, like I mentioned, I'm going to link out to several webinars, several blog posts that Winnie has written that kind of dives a little deeper into some of these specific questions that you guys asked, so that you guys can get a little bit more information that way as well. And as always, please feel free to share any of the blogs or the recording with any other teachers or educators that you think might find it valuable. I'm not seeing any other questions, Winnie.
Okay.
So I think we'll wrap up. Winnie, I'd like to thank you for
before we
fabulous.
Before we wrap up too much, there is also Brooke will include in the email. There's also a link to an educator network, and I'm bringing this up for this conversation because I feel like that there are some questions that also could be shared across the board. For example, how do you deal with a teacher that doesn't want you educating all the kids in the class? We at Admentum, we have an educator network that allows us to share these questions with other educators across the country to gather their response. It's a connected educator group of teachers that are there to support you. So inside the link inside the email that you will be sending will include the link to the educator network. It's just a couple of questions of who you are and what you do. It can be as invasive as you want it to be. If you choose to answer questions or meet with curriculum or be part of the Facebook group, great. If not, that's okay too. You can just benefit from reading what comes across your desk. So I'll leave that at that.
Yep, I'll include a link to that as well. And then so you guys know, that's going to come from me, so brooke.fawcett@edmentum.com. So if you don't see it by tomorrow afternoon around this time, check your spam folders just to make sure that it didn't fly into there. But there'll be a bunch of great resources within that email. And like I said, feel free to share that out with anybody as well. Winnie, another wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for this today. And then me and Winnie would like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. We know how precious as an educator your time is. And so we really like that you came and you interacted with us today. There will also be a link to an attendance certificate for those of you that would like to receive one. When you get the email tomorrow, you'll just click in there and you'll fill out a short little form with your name and then the name of the session, and you'll be able to download that for continuing education as well. But yeah, we hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.